The Blackwood estate sprawled across the hills like a slumbering lion, its mane of ancient oaks and neatly trimmed hedges cascading down to a shimmering ribbon of river. For anyone passing by on the country road, the wrought iron gates bearing the family crest were an entrance to a fairy tale. A world of flawless lawns, marble fountains, and the promise of an eternal, unshakable order. But for Seraphina Blackwood, it was the most beautiful prison in the world, and the gilded bars of her cage grew heavier with each passing day. Tonight, those bars felt especially cold. The dining room was bathed in the soft light of a crystal chandelier, casting rainbow glimmers on the mirror-polished mahogany table. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wax candles, the wilting lilies in the centerpiece, and a subtle but pervasive sense of disappointment. Alastair says the auction was exceptionally successful. Her father, Mr. Henry Blackwood, announced, carving his roast beef with surgical precision. His voice, like everything in this house, was measured and permitted no argument. He didn't look at his daughter. His attention was fixed on the perfect slice of meat on his plate. He's acquired a controlling stake in maritime shipping. Quite astute. That young man has a brilliant future ahead of him. Your mother and I are very pleased. Seraphina silently prodded her asparagus with a fork. Alastair, a brilliant future. The words sounded like an epitaph for her own life, a life that had not yet begun. Her fiancé was an exact copy of her father, only 30 years younger. The same impeccable part in his hair, the same polite emptiness in his eyes, and the same unshakable certainty that the world was a collection of assets to be managed correctly. Including her, Seraphina, the most valuable asset of the Blackwood family. Darling, you should have seen Lady Warrington's dress at the charity ball. Her mother, Isabella, chimed in, lifting a water glass to her lips. Her smile was as perfectly taut as the string of pearls around her neck. A garish green, utterly tasteless. I'm so glad we chose that blue silk from Madame Dupont for you. You will look exquisite in it at the engagement party. The engagement. They spoke of it as if it were a settled matter, another deal signed and sealed. Seraphina felt a tight knot forming in her throat. She looked up and met her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. A pale, oval face, large gray eyes that held nothing but weariness, and a wave of dark hair styled in an elaborate updo from which she longed to pull out every pin. She looked like a porcelain doll taken out of its box for a special occasion. I'm a little tired, she said quietly, pushing aside her almost untouched plate. May I go to my room? Her father finally graced her with a glance. A flicker of irritation crossed his eyes, but he only gave a short nod. Go, but we expect you for breakfast tomorrow at 9 sharp. We need to discuss the guest list. Alastair sent his version, and it needs to be reconciled with ours. She rose, feeling like a puppet being released until the next performance. In her room, vast and cool and furnished with antiques, Seraphina went to the window and threw it open. The night air, smelling of damp earth, roses, and freedom, rushed in. Below, under the moonlight, the estate gardens seemed like a mysterious, magical world, completely different from the suffocating reality of the house. It was her only sanctuary, the one place where she could breathe. The next morning, having skipped breakfast and the inevitable discussion of her fate, she escaped to the farthest part of the garden. There, where the formal flower beds gave way to wilder thickets, an old stone pond lay hidden by weeping willows. Her favorite spot was here by an old, almost forgotten rose garden. Most of the bushes had died or run wild, and only one, the largest and gnarliest, still clung to life. The plant had never bloomed for as long as she could remember, but in its stubborn struggle for existence, Seraphina saw something kindred. She sat on a stone bench with a book of poetry but couldn't focus. Thoughts of the impending engagement circled like vultures. It was then that she noticed him. A man was kneeling before that very same stubborn rose bush. She had seen him before in passing. One of the gardeners, young, not much older than herself. He wore simple work clothes, stained with earth. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing strong, lightly tanned forearms. His dark, honey-colored hair was tousled by the wind. But it wasn't that which caught her attention. She was struck by how he worked. There was no haste or mechanical routine in his movements. The gardener was loosening the soil around the roots with an incredible gentleness. His large, strong hands moving carefully as if he were dealing not with a thorny bush, but with something fragile and precious. He was muttering something quietly to himself, and it seemed to Serafina that he was talking to the plant. She watched him for several minutes, holding her breath. There was something real in his focused expression, something she had never seen in the polished faces of her father's guests. He wasn't playing a role. He simply was. Finally, unable to restrain herself, she spoke, and her own voice seemed too loud in the morning quiet. "Will it ever bloom?" The gardener started and slowly looked up. His eyes were a startling blue, like a summer sky after rain. For a moment, surprise flickered in them, but not the servility or fear she was used to seeing in the eyes of the staff. He looked at her directly, as an equal. "It needs time," he answered. His voice was low and calm with a slight rasp. "And the right care. Old roots don't like to be rushed." Getting to his feet and brushing the dirt from his knees, the worker was taller than she had thought. "The soil here is too dense. For years, no one let it breathe. It was simply left to die." Serafina moved closer, smelling the freshly turned earth. "Do you think it can be helped?" "Anything can be helped, if there's a will." He offered a small smile, and crinkles formed at the corners of his eyes. "This variety is called Angel's Breath. A long time ago, this entire rose garden was filled with them. Its flowers are white, with a tiny pink edge on the petals. At least that's what the old books say." The young man spoke about the rose with such tenderness and knowledge that Serafina was mesmerized. For the first time in a long while, someone was talking to her not about money, status, or duty, but about something simple and alive. "My name is Ethan," he said, extending his hand and then immediately hesitating. Looking down at his earth-stained palm, he awkwardly pulled it back. "My apologies." "Serafina," she replied softly, pretending not to notice his embarrassment. She desperately wanted to shake his soiled hand, to feel the warmth and the earth on her skin. At that moment, the crystal-clear chime of a bell summoning them for lunch rang out from somewhere behind the trees. It was her signal to return to her cage. "I have to go," she said, a shadow falling over her face again. Ethan simply nodded. He didn't say Miss Blackwood or ma'am. He just looked at her with his blue eyes, and in his gaze, for a fleeting moment, she saw not the lady of the manor, but just a girl. She turned and walked up the path toward the house, but she could feel his eyes on her back. Turning at the hedgerow, she saw he was still standing there, watching her go. And then he knelt again before the old rose bush, returning to his work, to his quiet, real life. And for the first time in many years, the garden seemed to Serafina not just a sanctuary, but a place where something new could be born. Something that smelled not of lilies and wax, but of damp earth and hope. Lunch was as predictable as dinner. Cold soup, chicken salad, and her mother's incessant chatter about upcoming social events. Serafina sat in silence, mechanically lifting the spoon to her mouth, but her thoughts were far away, in the abandoned rose garden. The image of Ethan kneeling before the rose bush, his blue eyes, and his calm voice replayed in her mind. "And of course, we must order new invitations. Lady Hampton's old calligrapher has retired," Isabella chirped. "Serafina, darling, are you listening to me? I'm talking about your engagement." "Yes, mother." "The calligrapher," Serafina replied distractedly. Her mother gave her a sharp look. "You're not yourself today. I hope you're not falling ill. We have so much to do." "Just a slight headache," Serafina lied. It was the easiest lie, a universal key that unlocked almost any door in her world. After lunch, she went up to her room on the pretext of resting. But instead, she went to the window overlooking the gardens. From here, the old rose garden wasn't visible, hidden by overgrown trees. But she knew it was there, and perhaps Ethan was there too. The knowledge warmed her from the inside. She spent the rest of the day in a strange daze. She sorted through her silk dresses, flipped through books without seeing the words, and answered her parents' questions monosyllabically. Everything felt fake, like a stage set. The only real thing had been the conversation that morning. The next day, she woke with an inexplicable sense of anticipation. She dressed more simply than usual, in a plain linen dress that didn't restrict her movement and comfortable shoes. Ignoring her mother's puzzled look at breakfast, she headed to the garden again. Her heart beat a little faster as she turned onto the familiar path. Ethan was there. He was setting up a wooden support for the old bush, tying the longest branches to it. Hearing her footsteps, the gardener turned. A slight smile touched his lips. "Good morning. Good morning," she replied, trying to keep her voice even. I came to see how it was doing. It'll be easier for it with something to lean on," Ethan said, finishing his work. "It's been fighting alone for too long." Those simple words echoed painfully in Serafina's soul. She went over and touched one of the gnarled stems. "Have you always been a gardener?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. The young man shrugged, wiping his hands on his trousers. "My father was, and my grandfather. I suppose it's in our blood. A love for things that grow from the earth." He looked at his hands. "Not the most profitable business, but it's honest. And it teaches you patience." "Patience?" "Yes, you can't force a flower to bloom before its time. You can only create the right conditions, care for it, wait, and have faith. Nature does the rest." They fell silent. The quiet was broken only by the singing of birds and the rustling of leaves. This silence wasn't awkward, like at the dinner table with her parents. It was full. "I brought something," Ethan said, and walked over to his canvas bag lying by the bench. He took out a small clay pot with a tiny green sprout in it. "I took a cutting from the old bush a few weeks ago. I hoped it would take root. And it did." He held the pot out to her. "I thought, maybe you'd like to put it in your room, to watch it grow." Serafina carefully took the pot. It was warm from the sun. The tiny sprout, with its two small leaves, seemed incredibly fragile and yet full of life. It was the simplest and most precious gift she had ever received. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at him. There were tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Ethan." The gardener smiled, embarrassed. "Just water it, and don't put it in direct sunlight." In that moment, she knew she had crossed some invisible line. This little sprout wasn't just a plant. It was a secret, their shared secret. And this secret was dangerous, thrilling, and infinitely more real than her entire life had been before. She clutched the pot to her chest and walked back to the house, feeling that she was carrying something more than just a future rose. She was carrying the beginning of something that could either save her or destroy her. The little clay pot became the center of Serafina's universe. She smuggled it into the house, hiding it under her shawl like a smuggler carrying treasure. In her room, she placed it on a windowsill overlooking the inner courtyard, where it was unlikely anyone would notice it from outside. Every day she watered the sprout, touched its tiny leaves, and talked to it as if it could understand her. This sprout was her hope, living proof that even from an old, abandoned root, new life could emerge. It was her connection to Ethan. Her morning walks turned into a daily ritual she awaited with a fluttering heart. She no longer brought a book with her. The garden itself was the book, and Ethan was its narrator. She would find him in different corners of the estate. By the pond where he cleaned the lilies, in the orangery where he tended the orchids, or by the old stone wall he was mending so that wild grapes could climb it. Their conversations flowed easily and naturally. Ethan told her about the language of flowers, how the lunar cycles affect plant growth, about the birds whose nests he found in the branches of old trees. She, in turn, for the first time in her life, spoke about herself. Not as Miss Blackwood, heiress to a fortune, but as Serafina. She told him about her childhood dreams of becoming an artist, about the books that made her cry, about the feeling of loneliness in a house full of guests. The gardener listened to her as no one had ever listened before, attentively, without interrupting, and in his blue eyes, she saw understanding, not judgment or pity. One day, he led her behind the orangery, to a place she never knew existed. There, hidden from prying eyes by a thick shrubbery, was a small clearing overgrown with wild bluebells. Their blue heads swayed in the wind, creating a solid, chiming carpet. "I found this place my first year here," Ethan said quietly, standing beside her. "No one ever comes here. It's like the garden's secret." The air was filled with a honeyed fragrance. Serafina took a step into the clearing, and thousands of little bells swayed at her feet. She laughed, for the first time in a long time, genuinely and freely. Ethan watched her, his face serious and tender. "Laughter suits you," he said so softly she could barely hear him. She turned to him. They were standing so close she could see the golden flecks in his eyes. He took a step toward her, and his hand reached for her face as if to brush away a stray lock of hair. His fingers almost touched her cheek, but at that moment, he froze. The tension between them became almost palpable, thick like the scent of the flowers. He slowly lowered his hand. The world stood still for one infinite moment. Reality returned with Alistair's visit the following weekend. He arrived in his new sports car, sleek and predatory, which looked out of place against the backdrop of the ancient estate. At lunch, he talked nonstop about the stock market, his plans to expand his business, and the yacht he intended to buy after their wedding. "By the way, Henry," he said to her father, "I've been thinking, these gardens, they take up too much valuable land. We could build a guest complex here with a golf course. It would significantly increase the estate's value." Serafina froze, fork in hand. The blood drained from her face. She imagined bulldozers tearing down the old trees, the field of wild bluebells being covered in concrete. "That's an interesting thought, Alistair." Her father nodded approvingly. "Very practical. The gardens are the soul of this house," Serafina blurted out. Her voice trembled with anger. All eyes turned to her. Alistair looked at her with a condescending smile. "The soul, my dear? The soul doesn't pay dividends. Don't worry, we'll leave a few flower beds by the main entrance. For aesthetics." He winked at her as if they were in on it together, and the gesture made her feel nauseous. She looked at his manicured hands resting on the tablecloth and compared them to Ethan's strong, earth-stained hands. Hands that created life, not calculated the profit from its destruction. Later, as she walked with Alistair down the main avenue, at her mother's insistence, who believed they needed to spend time together, he casually pointed his cane at a group of gardeners working by the fountain. Ethan was among them. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In Ethan's gaze, she saw pain, and in her own, she knew there was despair. Alistair followed her gaze. "We'll need to hire a new team when we start construction," he drawled lazily. "A more professional one. These country bumpkins are only good for pulling weeds." That evening, Serafina stood at her window, looking at her little sprout. It had grown noticeably in the past weeks, putting out several new leaves. It was so fragile, yet so stubborn, just like her budding feelings. She knew Alistair's words were not just words. They were a declaration of war. A war against everything that had become dear to her. Against the soul of this place. Against Ethan. And she realized she could no longer be a passive observer in her own life. She would have to fight. But how do you fight a world where the soul pays no dividends? A resolution, as cold and hard as steel, settled in Serafina's soul. She was no longer a porcelain doll, passively awaiting her fate. The threat to the gardens had become a threat to her own newly budding self. She understood that emotional protests and pleas for the soul of the place would be shattered against the wall of her father's and Alistair's pragmatism. She needed a weapon they would understand. Facts, figures, history. The day after Alistair left, she headed to the library. It was a vast, rarely visited room in the west wing of the house that smelled of dust and old leather. Generations of Blackwoods had collected books here, but for her parents, the library was just another decorative element. Serafina, however, had loved this place since childhood. Here, among the silent volumes, she felt closer to her family's history than at the dinner table. She began methodically, shelf by shelf, searching for anything related to the estate. Old maps, household account books, albums with faded photographs. Hours turned into days. Dust settled on her dark dress. Her fingers blackened with old ink. She found the house plans, receipts for the orangery's construction, but nothing that could protect the garden. On the third day of her search, having climbed a stepladder to the farthest corner, she came across a row of battered, leather-bound volumes. They were the diaries of her great-great-grandmother, Lady Eloise Blackwood, a woman rarely mentioned in the family. Opening the first diary, Serafina plunged into a world that seemed to exist in another dimension. Eloise had been a passionate botanist and artist. She didn't just live at the estate. She created it. It was she who had designed the gardens, bringing rare plants from all over the world. It was in the diary entry for 1885 that Serafina found what she was looking for. Eloise wrote with delight about the creation of her heart of the garden, the Angel's Breath Rose Garden. She wrote that this variety, which she believed was nearly lost, had been brought by her from a mountain monastery in the Alps. But that wasn't all. Turning the fragile pages, Serafina found an official document glued into the diary. It was a deed of gift, by which Lady Eloise bequeathed the gardens to the Royal Botanical Society for perpetual use as a living museum and national treasure, on the condition that her descendants would care for them. The document clearly stated that any attempt to change the fundamental structure of the garden or destroy its key elements, especially the rose garden, would result in the entire estate coming under the Society's management. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. This was more than a weapon. It was a shield. Her father, obsessed with property and status, would never risk losing Blackwood Manor. He either didn't know about this document or considered it a long-lost formality. With a pounding heart, she hid the diary and the document under her shawl and hurried to the garden. She had to tell Ethan. She found him by the old stone wall, replacing a crumbling stone. Seeing her excited and triumphant face, he put down his tools. "Did something happen?" he asked, a note of alarm in his voice. She couldn't speak. She simply walked up to him and, forgetting everything, handed him the diary, open to the right page. Ethan carefully took it in his strong, lime-stained hands and began to read. His brows furrowed, his blue eyes scanning the faded lines attentively. When he reached the deed of gift, he looked up at her, astonished. Is this real? I found it in the library. My father must not know. Or he forgot," she breathed. Ethan looked from the document to her. A storm of emotions crossed his face. Disbelief, relief, and something else, something deeper. He carefully closed the diary and handed it back to her. "You saved it, Serafina," he said quietly. And for the first time, he said her name without a hint of shyness, as if they were comrades in a common battle. "You saved them all." He didn't just mean the gardens. He was talking about the workers, about himself, about the legacy they both cherished. In that moment, the gulf between them, the gulf of status, money, and origin, seemed insignificant. They were united by something greater. Unable to contain her emotions, Serafina did what she had dreamed of since their first meeting. She covered his hand, which lay on the stonework, with her own. His skin was rough and warm. He tensed for a moment under her fingers, and then his large palm turned over and gently squeezed hers. It was a simple touch, but it held everything: gratitude, trust, a promise. The world narrowed to this patch of ground by the old wall, to the warmth of their joined hands, and to the shared secret that now bound them forever. That evening, passing by her father's study, she heard his voice, loud and businesslike, on the telephone. "Yes, Alistair, I received the preliminary drawings from the architects. Looks excellent. We'll start clearing the site next month." A chill ran down Serafina's spine. The shield was found, but the battle was just beginning. And she knew she would have to fight not only for the gardens but for the right to hold a gardener's hand. Serafina knew she had to choose her moment with the same care Ethan chose the day to prune roses. She couldn't act rashly. She waited for 2 days, 2 long days during which she behaved like the perfect daughter. Coming down for breakfast on time, discussing lace for her wedding dress with her mother, and smiling politely when her father talked about Alistair's plans. She was calm, but it was the calm before the storm. Lady Eloise's diary lay wrapped in silk in her desk drawer, like a loaded pistol. The perfect moment came on Thursday evening. Her father was in an excellent mood. He had just closed another profitable deal and had opened a bottle of expensive French wine to celebrate. Her mother was absorbed in planning the menu for an upcoming reception. They were sitting in the small drawing room, and the atmosphere was almost relaxed. "Father," Serafina began, her voice so steady it surprised her. "I would like to talk to you and Mother about the gardens." Henry Blackwood waved a dismissive hand, as if shooing away a fly. "Serafina, we've already decided. Alistair's project is magnificent." "Alistair's project is impossible," she replied calmly. Silence fell. Her father slowly lowered his glass. Her mother stopped writing and looked up at her in surprise. "What did you say?" Steel-edged Henry's voice. Serafina stood up, went to her writing desk, took out the diary, and placed it on the polished table between her parents. "I spent a few days in the library, and I found this." She opened the diary to the page with the deed of gift. "This is the diary of Lady Eloise Blackwood, your great-grandmother. And this," she pointed a finger at the glued-in document, "is a legally certified deed of gift, bequeathing the estate's gardens to the Royal Botanical Society for perpetual use as a living museum." Her father squinted in disbelief. He took the diary and began to read, his face gradually darkening. Her mother peered over his shoulder, her lips moving in bewilderment. "It states here," Serafina continued, enunciating each word, "that any fundamental change to the landscape, and especially the destruction of the Angel's Breath Rose Garden, will result in the immediate enforcement of the Society's full ownership rights over the entire Blackwood estate. Not just the gardens, the house, all the land." Henry Blackwood slammed the diary shut with such force that dust flew into the air. His face turned purple. This is absurd. An old piece of paper with no legal standing. It's a legal document, Father, with seals and signatures. I'm sure any lawyer would confirm its validity. And I'm sure the Royal Botanical Society would be delighted to acquire such an estate, should we give them a reason. "Are you threatening me?" he hissed, rising to his feet. "I am protecting our heritage," Serafina replied firmly, looking him straight in the eye. "What you and Alistair are planning is not just vandalism. It's a violation of the will of the woman who created this place. And it could cost us everything we have." "Henry, what does all this mean?" Isabella intervened, her voice trembling. The thought of losing her home and status horrified her more than any bulldozer. This woman, could she really have done such a thing? She was eccentric, her father ground out, but his voice no longer held its former confidence. He paced the room like a caged tiger. But to do this, to betray her own descendants, victory brought Serafina no joy. She looked at her enraged father, at her bewildered mother, and saw not tyrants, but two people trapped by their own ambitions. An icy, heavy, suffocating silence hung in the room. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. The next morning, she found Ethan by the old rose garden. He saw her from a distance and understood everything from the expression on her face. "You did it," he said. It was a statement, not a question. She nodded, sitting down on the stone bench. Fatigue washed over her. "They are furious. The house is colder now than a cellar in winter. But there's nothing they can do. The gardens are safe." Ethan sat down beside her, closer than ever before. "That was very brave, Serafina." She looked at him. There was a smudge of dirt on his cheek, and his hair was tousled by the wind. And no one had ever seemed so beautiful to her. She could feel the warmth of his shoulder next to hers. "I was scared," she confessed in a whisper. "Fear means you have something worth fighting for," he replied quietly. Ethan raised his hand and gently, almost weightlessly, wiped the dirt from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was like an electric shock. She froze, unable to breathe, looking into his blue eyes. He slowly leaned towards her. His breath touched her lips, The world disappeared, leaving only the beat of her heart and the scent of roses. But at that very moment, a sharp, grating sound made them both flinch and pull apart. On the path leading to the rose garden stood the head butler, Mr. Fielding. His face was, as always, impassive, but in his small, beady eyes, Seraphina saw a cold, all-knowing glint. "Miss Blackwood," he said in his dry voice, "your father wishes to see you in his study." Immediately, the walk from the rose garden to her father's study seemed longer to Seraphina than her entire life. Each step on the crunching gravel echoed like a dull throb in her temples. She walked behind Fielding's impassive back, feeling like a condemned prisoner being led to the scaffold. She didn't look back, but she knew Ethan was still there, by the old rose bush, as frozen and helpless as she was. Her father's study was his sanctuary. The walls, paneled in dark oak, were hung with portraits of stern ancestors. The air was thick with the smell of leather, cigar smoke, and power. Henry Blackwood stood at the window with his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him. He didn't turn when she entered. "Close the door," he ordered. His voice was deceptively calm. "Fielding, you may go." The door clicked shut, cutting Seraphina off from the rest of the world. She stood in the middle of a vast Persian rug, feeling small and vulnerable. "I lost the battle for the gardens," her father began, still looking out the window. "You turned out to be more cunning than I expected. Found a loophole, well done. Your great-great-grandmother was just as stubborn a fool." He paused, then slowly turned. His face was like an icy mask, but a cold fire burned in his eyes. "But you will not win the war for this family's future, and I will not allow you to disgrace our name." "I don't understand what you mean," Seraphina whispered, though her heart was already sinking with a terrible premonition. "You don't understand?" he sneered, and the sneer was more frightening than a scream. "Fielding reported to me that your botanical research has become rather intimate. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could lead me by the nose? Meeting with that ditch digger?" He spat the word ditch digger out like dirt. Seraphina flushed. "His name is Ethan, and we were just talking." Talking? Her father took a step towards her, and she involuntarily stepped back. "I know where such talks lead. I am not blind, nor am I an idiot. You are a Blackwood. You are to marry Alistair Croft, unite two fortunes, and secure the future of our lineage. And you're ready to trade all that for a dalliance with the help in the bushes." "That's not true. You don't know anything," she cried, her voice ringing with tears of despair and rage. "I know enough," he roared, his composure finally cracking. "And this ends now. From this moment on, you are forbidden to go into the garden without being accompanied by your mother or Miss Appleby. Your strolls are over. All your time will be dedicated to preparing for the engagement." He walked to his massive desk and sat in a chair that looked like a throne. He was in control again. "As for your friend," he continued in an icy tone. "Ethan, you said his name was? He and his family live in a cottage on our land. They've worked for us for 3 generations. One word from me, Seraphina, and tomorrow they will be out on the street. Without work, without a home, without references. No one in the entire county will even let him sweep yards after I'm done with him. His future, his family's future, it's in your hands." Seraphina's world collapsed. This was worse than shouting, worse than prohibitions. It was a precise, cruel blow to the heart. He was using Ethan as a hostage. He had chained her with a chain forged from another person's well-being. You can't," she stammered, feeling a cold horror grip her. "I can, and I will if you give me the slightest reason." He cut her off. "So what will you choose, daughter? Your fleeting infatuation, or the life of the man you supposedly value so much? The choice is yours. Now go to your room." She left the study, her legs numb. The golden cage had slammed shut. Its walls were now invisible, but no less solid for it. She was trapped not in the house, but in the dilemma her father had set before her. Any act of defiance, any attempt to see Ethan, could destroy his life. Her love, barely born, had become a mortal threat to him. She sat in her room all evening, staring at the little sprout on the windowsill. It seemed as helpless as she was. How could they survive in this cold? Late at night, when the house fell silent, she made a decision. She couldn't let Ethan suffer. She had to warn him, to explain what was happening. But how? She took a sheet from her sketchbook and a charcoal pencil. She wouldn't write words that could be intercepted. Instead, she drew the angel's breath rose, then wrapped its stem in barbed wire, with drops of blood dripping from the thorns. Anyone else would see it as just a grim fantasy, but she knew Ethan would understand. He spoke the language of flowers. He would understand the language of symbols. Early in the morning, as the sky began to lighten, she heard the squeak of a gardener's wheelbarrow beneath her window. This was her only chance. Opening the window a crack, she waited until no one was below and dropped the folded paper. It fell directly into the empty wheelbarrow. A few minutes later, she saw Ethan approach it. He noticed the paper, picked it up, and unfolded it. He stood motionless in the morning mist, staring at the drawing for a long time. Then he slowly raised his head and looked at her window. Their eyes met for a moment. In his, she saw not fear, but pain and understanding. He clenched the paper in his fist and, without looking back, pushed the wheelbarrow away. The garden, their paradise, had become a battlefield, and they had both just received their first wounds. The days of silence began. Days when the only sounds in Serafina's life were the rustle of silk, the click-clack of her governess Miss Appleby's heels, and the monotonous voices of dance and etiquette tutors. Her world shrank to the size of her room, the drawing room, and the dining hall. The garden, her vibrant, living sanctuary, became a flat, unattainable picture behind the window pane. Her father kept his word. She did not take a single step outside without a vigilant escort. But the separation didn't kill their connection. It only forced it underground, to become quiet and invisible to prying eyes. Their communication turned into a secret language, understood only by them. Every morning, Serafina would go to the window, and almost always Ethan was somewhere in sight. Trimming the hedge, tending the flower beds on the main avenue, cleaning the fountain. He never looked directly at her window, but she knew he felt her gaze. And he would answer her. Sometimes it was a flower, accidentally left on the edge of the lawn. A yellow azalea, take care of yourself. A sprig of heather, loneliness. A white camellia, I admire you. Sometimes it was stones, arranged in a specific pattern at the edge of the path. Serafina would spend hours deciphering these messages, and they were the only thing keeping her alive. Her little sprout on the windowsill grew stronger, putting out new leaves, as if absorbing her longing and hope. Alistair returned a week later, beaming and self-satisfied. The news of the cancelled golf course project had annoyed him, but her father had apparently found a way to appease him, promising other investments. Now all his attention was focused on the wedding. He brought Serafina a diamond necklace as a gift, cold and heavy like a collar. "It will accentuate your neck, my dear," he said, fastening the clasp. His fingers were cool and dry. "Everyone will be looking only at you." She looked at their reflection in the mirror. Herself, pale with lifeless eyes, and him, smiling, confident in his right to possess her. She felt like an object, a beautiful accessory to his successful life. She stood at the window for a long time that day. Ethan was working below, by the old rose garden, which was barely visible through the trees. She couldn't see what he was doing, but his very presence there, at their spot, gave her strength. She watched, transfixed, until it began to get dark. And suddenly, as the last rays of sun broke through the foliage, she saw it. On one of the gnarled branches, among the old thorns, was a tiny green swelling. A bud. An incredible, impossible, stubborn bud. The first in many years. Serafina's heart beat so loudly it felt as if the whole house could hear it. It was a sign that life was stronger than death, that hope could sprout even from seemingly dead wood. She looked at her own sprout in the pot. It too looked particularly strong today. The next morning, she woke with a new feeling. Despair had been replaced by a trembling anticipation. Ethan must have seen it too, and he would let her know. She was not mistaken. In the afternoon, the gardener was working on the central lawn, directly under her windows, raking fallen leaves. Miss Appleby was dozing in an armchair in the corner of the room. Serafina, holding her breath, watched him. His movements seemed mundane, but she saw a hidden purpose in them. He wasn't raking the leaves into a pile. He was arranging them on the grass. Slowly, one by one, letters began to emerge from the yellow and crimson leaves on the green canvas. It was risky, insane, but he was doing it. When he finished and pushed his wheelbarrow away without looking back, Serafina read the message that could change everything. Midnight, orangery. Blood pounded in her temples. The orangery, the old, glass-walled extension at the far end of the garden, which was barely used. At night it was always locked, but Ethan was a gardener. He must have the keys. It was a challenge, direct and unequivocal. The risk was enormous. If they were caught, her father would carry out his threat. He would destroy Ethan. He would lock her in this cage forever, without the slightest glimmer of light. But the thought of seeing him again, hearing his voice, being near him for just a few minutes, was stronger than any fear. To sit locked up, slowly fading away, was tantamount to death. And this meeting, however dangerous, was a chance at life. She was on edge all evening. At dinner, she barely spoke, and even Alistair noticed the feverish glint in her eyes, mistaking it for a bride's shyness. When the hall clock struck 10, she wished everyone a good night and went up to her room. She stood at the window looking out at the dark garden. There was no moon, and the estate was shrouded in velvety blackness. Somewhere out there, in that darkness, Ethan was waiting for her. Her heart was torn between fear and elation. She didn't know what this night would bring, salvation or ruin. But she knew one thing: she would go. She would take this step out of her golden cage and into the unknown. The wait was torture. Serafina sat in her room, listening as the house grew quiet. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. That was Miss Appleby going to bed. A dull thud, Fielding locking the main door. The last to retire to his chambers was her father. She would have recognized his heavy, measured steps among 1,000. Finally, after 11, a deep, ringing silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the clock. She changed into the darkest dress she owned and threw a black shawl over her shoulders. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. Getting out of her room was the first test. The door had a habit of creaking. Serafina opened it millimeter by millimeter, holding her breath at every groan of the old wood. The corridor was dark, with only a faint moonlight filtering through a tall window on the landing, painting ghostly patterns on the floor. She knew the main staircase was the surest way to be heard. Instead, she crept to the narrow servants' staircase at the back of the house. The steps here were steep and worn, but they creaked less. Descending in the darkness, she touched the cold, rough wall, and every rustle made her freeze. Getting out of the house was the hardest part. All the doors were locked. The only way out was a window in the first-floor pantry. It was small and opened onto a thicket of ivy covering the wall. It took Serafina considerable effort to lift the heavy frame. The cold night air touched her flushed face. She climbed out of the window, clinging to the ivy, and jumped onto the soft ground, nearly crying out when the hem of her dress caught on a nail. At last she was free. But the garden at night was a different place. By day, her friend and sanctuary, it now seemed alien and full of threats. The shadows of the trees stretched into bizarre monsters, and the rustling of leaves sounded like a sinister whisper. She ran along the paths, trying to stay in the shadows, her shoes sinking into the damp grass. The orangery loomed ahead like the glass skeleton of a giant beast. There were no lights on inside. For a moment, a chilling fear gripped Serafina. What if he hadn't come? What if it was a trap? She cautiously approached the door. It was ajar. Her heart leaped. She slipped inside. The air inside was warm, humid, and thick with the scents of exotic flowers and damp earth. In the darkness, Only the silhouettes of huge ferns and palms were visible. "Serafina?" His voice came from very close by, as quiet as the rustle of leaves. She started and turned. Ethan emerged from behind a huge ficus tree, and in the faint light filtering through the glass roof, she saw his face, as familiar and as tormented as she had imagined. Without a word, she stepped toward him and he stepped toward her. The distance they had so carefully maintained vanished. He wrapped her in his arms, and she buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent of earth, rain, and him. All the tension of the past few days, all the fear and loneliness, poured out in silent tears that rolled down her cheeks and soaked into his rough work shirt. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," he whispered, his arms holding her tight as if he feared she would dissolve into thin air. "And I was afraid that my father—" she began, but he interrupted her. "Shoo. Don't talk about him. Not here. Right now, it's just us." Ethan gently pulled her back and took her face in his hands. His thumbs wiped the tears from her cheeks. Their eyes met. His blue eyes were filled with such tenderness, such pain, and such longing that her breath caught again. All words became unnecessary. He slowly leaned down and kissed her. This was nothing like that almost kiss in the rose garden. This one was real, deep, full of despair and hope. His lips were soft yet insistent, and she responded with all the passion she could muster. It was a kiss that broke all the rules, burned all the bridges. In that moment, there was no wealthy heiress, no poor gardener. There were only a man and a woman who had found each other in the midst of a hostile world. When they finally broke apart, breathing heavily, he pressed his forehead against hers. "I can't do this anymore, Serafina," he breathed. "Seeing you every day and not being able to even speak to you, knowing they're giving you to another man, it's killing me. What are we going to do, Ethan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw the bud," he said, a note of hope in his voice. "On the old bush. I knew it was a sign that we shouldn't give up." He pulled back and looked at her seriously. "I've been thinking about it all these days. I have some savings. My cousin lives up north, he has his own farm. He always needs a helping hand. It's not the life you're used to. This hard work, simple food, a small house. But we'll be free. Together." Serafina stood frozen, listening to him. He was proposing they run away, not just from the house, but from her entire life. To give up everything, wealth, status, family, for a future with him. A future full of hardship and uncertainty, but illuminated by love. You're asking me to leave with you? I'm asking you to choose a life, Serafina. Our life," he said, squeezing her hands. "I love you." 3 simple words. The words she had so longed for and so feared to hear. They echoed in the silence of the orangery like a vow. Before she could answer, a sharp sound came from outside. The crunch of gravel under someone's heavy boot. They froze, listening. The footsteps were getting closer. Someone was walking directly toward the orangery. A set of keys jingled at the door handle. Panic struck like a wave of icy water. In an instant, the warmth of their embrace was replaced by animalistic terror. Ethan reacted first. He grabbed her hand and, without a word, pulled her into the dense foliage, into the far corner of the orangery where sprawling tree ferns grew in huge tubs. Their feathery leaves created a thick, almost impenetrable wall of shadow. He pushed her behind the largest tub, pressed her against the wall, and shielded her with his body, clamping his hand over her mouth to stop her from crying out. The lock clicked, the door creaked open, and a bright beam of light from an oil lantern cut through the darkness. A tall, gaunt figure appeared in the doorway. Mr. Fielding. Serafina's heart plummeted and stopped. She could feel Ethan's heart pounding furiously against her back. His hand on her mouth was firm and warm, smelling of earth. Fielding entered slowly, his steps on the stone floor echoing under the glass roof. He wasn't doing a night patrol. His movements were purposeful. He raised the lantern, and its beam crawled slowly along the rows of plants. Serafina squeezed her eyes shut, certain the light was about to expose them. She could see the dancing shadows of leaves on Ethan's face, making him look like a stone statue. There was no fear in his eyes, only extreme concentration and fury. The butler stopped in the center of the orangery. He wasn't looking for them. He was looking for something else. His gaze was fixed on the floor. He bent down, and the lantern light illuminated the damp footprint left by Seraphina's wet shoes. "I know you're here, Miss Blackwood," Fielding said into the silence. His voice was as dry and colorless as ever, but now it held a note of triumph. "Your father was concerned about your state. He asked me to keep an eye on you tonight. I saw you climb out of the pantry window." Silence. Only the rustling of leaves and the heavy breathing of two people caught in a trap. "You can come out," Fielding continued. "It will be much worse if I have to call the guards. And you, young man," his voice grew even colder, "have an appointment with Mr. Blackwood. He will be very disappointed." Ethan didn't move. His body was tense as a drawn bowstring. Seraphina could feel his desperation mounting. She knew his fate, the fate of his family, was being decided right now. Her father's threat was no longer hypothetical. It was about to become a reality. It was in that moment that Seraphina made a decision. Her fear for Ethan outweighed her own. She gently removed his hand from her mouth and, before he could stop her, stepped out from behind the ferns. "I am alone, Fielding," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, sounded firm and authoritative. She stepped into the lantern light, her head held high. "I couldn't sleep and decided to get some fresh air." The door was unlocked. Fielding gave her a cold, piercing look. He clearly didn't believe her. His eyes scanned the shadows behind her. "Are you sure you're alone, miss? Are you doubting my word, Fielding?" she retorted, using the same tone her father used with the staff. "Or are you planning to search the orangery in the middle of the night like some constable? I will return to my room at once. And tomorrow morning, my father and I will discuss your excessive zeal." It was a bluff, desperate and risky, but it worked. For a moment, uncertainty flickered on the butler's face. To go against a direct order from the master's daughter was dangerous. He was a servant, and she had just reminded him of that. "As you wish, Miss Blackwood," he bowed stiffly. "I will see you safely to your room." He stepped aside, letting her pass towards the exit. She cast a quick, farewell glance into the darkness where Ethan was hiding and walked out of the orangery. Fielding followed a few steps behind, his lantern casting their long, grotesque shadows on the gravel. When they returned to the house, he silently locked the pantry window behind her and escorted her to her bedroom door. "Good night, miss," he said, and she thought she heard a hidden threat in his voice. Closing the door behind her, Seraphina leaned against it, her strength failing her. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor, trembling all over. She had saved Ethan, at least for tonight, but at what cost? Fielding would surely report everything to her father, embellishing the details. Her lie was too fragile. She crawled to the window and peered into the darkness. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was still there, in their glass prison, cut off from her. And the question he had asked her an hour ago now echoed in her head like a death knell. What are we going to do? His plan to escape, so bold and beautiful, now seemed almost impossible. They had been caught. The cage had grown even tighter. But when she looked at her little rose sprout on the windowsill, she saw something new. It wasn't just a symbol of hope. It was a symbol of struggle. It was fighting its way to life from a dead branch. And she would fight too. The answer to Ethan's question ripened in her soul, as hard and clear as a diamond. She wouldn't just leave with him. She would escape. And whatever it cost, she would find a way to do it. This night was not the end. It was the beginning of the real war. Breakfast the next morning was held in icy silence. Seraphina could feel her father's heavy gaze on her, but he didn't say a word about the night's events. This was worse than shouting. His silence was a tactic, a way of showing her he knew everything and was in control. He wasn't going to cause a scandal that could tarnish the family's reputation on the eve of the engagement. Instead, he decided to tighten the noose around her neck more slowly. "Alistair will arrive this afternoon," he announced, neatly slicing a grapefruit. "We have decided that the official engagement should take place as soon as possible. The party will be held here, at the estate, next Saturday." Next Saturday. Only 10 days. The ticking of the hall clock suddenly became deafening. That was her deadline. 10 days to plan and execute an escape. "That's wonderful, dear." Her mother beamed, oblivious to the tension. "We must send out the invitations immediately. Serafina, darling, we'll go into town today to choose a dress for you." The escape from the orangery had changed her. Fear still lived inside her, but now it was joined by a cold, calculating fury. She was no longer a victim. She had become a conspirator. All day, she played her part, smiling as she tried on silk and lace dresses, discussing the menu and guest list with her mother. But in her mind, she was plotting routes, assessing risks, searching for weak points in her prison's defenses. The main problem was communicating with Ethan. She had no doubt that he was now being watched as closely as she was. Their secret language of flowers and stones was too dangerous. They needed a new channel. Help came from where she least expected it. In the evening, as the young maid Anna was collecting her dinner tray, she lingered at the door. Anna was a quiet girl from the village, about her age, and Serafina had often seen sympathy in her large brown eyes. "Miss," Anna whispered without looking up. "This morning, Mr. Fielding was questioning all the gardeners, asking who was on duty last night. Ethan said it was him. Said he was checking the heating in the orangery because a frost was predicted." Serafina froze. Ethan had found a plausible explanation. He had protected them both. "He asked me to tell you." Anna hesitated for a moment, afraid to meet her gaze. "He asked to say that the frost might return, and that the most fragile flowers need protection." This was it. Their new line of communication. The fragile flowers, that was her. The protection, that was the escape plan. And Anna, risking her job, had become their messenger. "Anna," Serafina said quietly, and the girl finally looked up at her with frightened eyes. "Can I trust you?" Anna nodded silently, her face pale but determined. That evening, Serafina wrote her first real letter to Ethan. It wasn't just a note, but a detailed plan. She didn't use the blackwood-crested paper. Instead, she tore a blank page from her old sketchbook. "My dearest Ethan," she wrote, "I agree. I choose our life. But we must be smarter. They will catch us if we just run. But there is one chance. The engagement party. Next Saturday. The whole house will be full of guests. The staff will be run off their feet. No one will notice I'm gone until morning. I will leave the house around midnight, when the music is at its loudest. We'll meet at the old boathouse on the river. From there we can get away unnoticed. Pack only what is essential. I will take only a little money and some jewelry that can be sold. Burn this letter. If you agree, tomorrow morning, when you are working by the fountain, adjust the blue handkerchief around your neck. If not, the red one. Yours forever, S." She folded the note into a small square, and the next morning, when Anna came to clean the room, she slipped it discreetly into the pocket of her apron. Waiting for his reply was unbearable. She sat by the window, watching Ethan and the other gardeners clean the fountain basin. She saw Anna approach them with a pitcher of water. She saw her say something to Ethan and saw him nod. Minutes passed that felt like an eternity. And then, the gardener straightened up to wipe the sweat from his brow. He took off his hat and pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. Serafina held her breath. Her heart stopped. He slowly, almost casually, tied the handkerchief around his neck. The handkerchief was bright blue. The blue handkerchief became the signal flag that marked the beginning of their quiet war. The 10 days turned into a countdown, where every minute was filled with purpose, fear, and hope. Blackwood Manor buzzed with life, preparing for the grand celebration. Suppliers arrived from all directions. Florists with armfuls of flowers, wine merchants with cases of champagne, tailors and decorators. This chaos became the perfect cover for Serafina. She became an actress playing her greatest role. With Alistair, who now hardly ever left the estate, She was the picture of demure obedience. She allowed him to hold her hand, discussed their Mediterranean honeymoon plans, and even managed to smile when he gifted her a pair of riding horses, boasting of their pedigree. Every self-satisfied glance, every possessive touch from him only fueled her resolve. She looked at him and saw not her future husband, but a jailer from whom she would soon escape. The preparations for her escape ran parallel to the preparations for her engagement. Under the pretext of choosing jewelry for the party, she gained access to her mother's safe. While her mother admired the diamonds, Serafina discreetly pocketed a few old gold coins and a small but very valuable sapphire brooch that had belonged to Lady Eloise. This was their starting capital. Clothing was the next problem. She needed simple, durable things. She found a solution in the attic, where old servants' clothes were stored. Rummaging through trunks under the guise of looking for antique lace for decorations, she found what she was looking for: a thick woolen skirt, a simple blouse, and sturdy, worn boots. She hid them in an old travel case, tucking it into the farthest corner of her wardrobe. Her connection with Ethan was maintained through Anna. Every morning, while collecting the tray, the maid would bring her a message, sometimes just a pressed flower meaning, "I'm thinking of you." Sometimes a short note on a scrap of paper. In one, Ethan informed her that he had spoken to his brother and that he was expecting them. In another, that he had prepared the boat in the boathouse and checked the road to the nearest train station. Each note was a breath of fresh air in the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Serafina, in turn, passed him a portion of the money through Anna so he could buy tickets and supplies. Anna did all this at great risk to herself, and Serafina knew she owed her her life. One evening, she asked the girl why she was helping them. "My older sister," Anna replied quietly, looking at the floor, "was married off to a farmer twice her age to pay off my father's debts. I saw the light go out in her eyes. No one should have to live like that, miss, especially not when they have love." The day before the party, Serafina took one last look out her window at the old rose garden. The bud she had noticed over a week ago had almost opened. You could already see the snow-white petals with the finest pink edge. The angel's breath was preparing to bloom. It was their sign, their blessing. The evening of the engagement party arrived. The house was awash with lights and music. Hundreds of candles burned in crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting in mirrors and champagne glasses. The air was filled with the buzz of voices, laughter, and the scent of perfume and expensive cigars. Serafina stood in the center of the ballroom in her new blue silk dress, next to a beaming Alistair. She accepted congratulations, smiled, nodded, but felt like a ghost at her own celebration. Her real life was far from here, waiting for her in the darkness, by the river. She danced with her father, and he squeezed her hand with a force that seemed to fear she might disappear. "You made the right choice, daughter," he ground out in her ear over the music. "You are a true Blackwood." She said nothing, only smiled faintly. She danced with Alistair, and he spun her in a waltz, whispering in her ear how proud he was of her, how everyone envied them. She looked over his shoulder at the large clock at the end of the hall. 10 minutes to midnight. When the dance ended, she complained of a headache and said she needed to step out onto the terrace for a moment of fresh air. Alistair wanted to go with her, but he was distracted by an important guest. "I'll be right back, my dear," she whispered, touching his arm one last time. She slipped out onto the terrace. The night air was cool and fresh after the stuffy ballroom. She didn't hesitate. Skirting groups of laughing guests, she disappeared into the darkness of a side alley. Tossing off her uncomfortable satin slippers, she ran barefoot across the damp grass. The music and laughter grew fainter, giving way to the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and finally, the quiet lapping of water. The dark silhouette of the old boathouse appeared ahead. The door was ajar. She peered inside. In the moonlight filtering through a hole in the roof, she saw him. Ethan was standing by the boat, in which their modest luggage was already stowed. He turned at the sound of her steps. His face was a mask of tense anticipation, fear, and boundless love. He stepped toward her and took her hand. "You came," he breathed. "I promised," she replied. Ethan looked at her ball gown, at the diamonds around her neck, and then into her eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked one last time. "There's no going back." She didn't answer. Instead, she decisively unfastened Alistair's cold necklace from her neck, walked to the open door, and with all her might, threw it into the dark water of the river. The splash glittered in the moonlight, and the jewel sank silently to the bottom. She turned to Ethan, a smile on her face. A free, genuine smile. "I've never been more sure." Serafina's gesture was louder than any words. Ethan looked at her, at the ripples spreading across the dark water, and his eyes reflected a mixture of astonishment and delight. He said nothing, only squeezed her hand tighter. There was no time for talk. "Quickly," he whispered, helping her into the boat. "We need to get as far away as possible before they realize you're gone." While he untied the rope, Serafina frantically began to change right there in the rocking boat. She shed the blue silk, which now felt like a foreign, false skin. Each layer of expensive fabric that fell to the bottom of the boat was a farewell to her past life. She pulled on the simple blouse and thick skirt, and shoved her feet into the rough boots she had prudently left in her travel case. These simple clothes gave her an unfamiliar but pleasant feeling of freedom and durability. As a final touch, she pulled the pins from her hair, and a heavy wave of dark hair fell onto her shoulders. She was no longer Miss Blackwood. She was just Serafina. Ethan took the oars. The boat pushed off silently from the bank and glided into the darkness. He rowed strongly and steadily, trying to stay close to the shady, willow-lined bank. Behind them, on the hill, the estate shone with lights, like a huge ship in a night ocean. Scraps of music still drifted from there, a mocking soundtrack to their escape. They sailed in silence, lost in their thoughts. The air was cold, smelling of river weeds and night-blooming flowers. Serafina sat in the stern, studying Ethan's face, illuminated only by the pale light of the stars. He was completely focused on rowing, his muscles straining under the thin fabric of his shirt. She had never felt safer. When they rounded a large bend in the river, the estate disappeared from view. The music faded. They were alone, just the two of them with the river and the night. It was in that moment that the full weight of her actions hit Serafina. She had run away. She had left everything. Family, home, a future that had been mapped out for her since birth. A sharp, cold fear pierced her. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. What if we can't make it? What if they find us?" He stopped rowing, and the boat drifted slowly with the current. He leaned forward and covered her cold hands with his own, which were warm and strong. "They'll be looking for a lady in silk and diamonds," he said quietly, looking directly into her eyes. "They'll look for her in expensive hotels and at the train stations of big cities. They will never think to look for a simple girl in work clothes and her farmer husband up north. We can do this, Serafina. As long as we're together, we can do anything." The word husband sounded so simple and so natural that it warmed her heart. He believed in them, and looking into his blue eyes, full of confidence, she believed too. They rowed for another hour until an old wooden bridge appeared ahead. This was their destination. They moored to the bank, pulled out their few belongings, and hid the boat in a thicket of reeds. "It's about a 3-mile walk to the station from here," Ethan said, slinging his bag over his shoulder and taking her case. The journey through the night forest was difficult. Twigs snapped underfoot. An owl hooted in the darkness. Serafina, used to parquet floors and manicured garden paths, stumbled over tree roots, but Ethan held her hand tightly, leading her on. He moved through the forest as confidently as he did through the estate gardens. This was his world, the world of nature, and now it was becoming her world too. Finally, the trees parted, and they saw the dim lights of a railway station. It was a tiny, sleepy station, consisting of a single platform and a small wooden building. A lone porter dozed on a bench. Ethan looked at the station clock. "We have half an hour until the morning milk train." It goes north and stops at every station. Just what we need." They sat on the farthest bench, trying to stay in the shadows. The night was ending. The sky in the east began to lighten, taking on a soft, pearlescent hue. Serafina pressed against Ethan's shoulder. He put his arm around her, and they sat like that, watching the birth of a new day. Their new day, when a train whistle sounded in the distance and a plume of smoke appeared around a bend. They stood up. The train slowly approached the platform, hissing steam. It was an old, battered train with a few cars. They quickly boarded an almost empty car and sat by a window. The train lurched and slowly began to move. Serafina looked out the window at the fields and forests receding behind them. She didn't look back. Her entire life was now here, in this carriage, in the warmth of Ethan's hand, which held hers tightly. The train picked up speed, carrying them north, into the unknown, into a new life they had chosen for themselves. And as the first rays of the rising sun touched her face, Serafina closed her eyes and, for the first time in many years, felt truly free. The journey north was like a dream. Days and nights blurred into a sequence of clattering wheels, changing landscapes outside the window, and a quiet, cozy silence. They barely spoke, but words weren't necessary. Every touch, every glance affirmed that they had made the right choice. The exhaustion from their ordeal mixed with the euphoria of freedom. Serafina slept with her head on Ethan's shoulder, and for the first time in years, she didn't have nightmares about her golden cage. 2 days later, they disembarked at a small station lost among the hills. The air here was different, cleaner, cooler, and smelling of pine and damp earth. A tall, weather-beaten man with the same blue eyes as Ethan, but with a sterner expression, was waiting for them on the platform. "Jacob?" Ethan smiled, hugging the man. "This is Serafina." Ethan's cousin, Jacob, gave Serafina a long, appraising look. He glanced at her soft, manicured hands, her aristocratic posture, and a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. But he said nothing, only gave a short nod. "Get in the wagon. Martha's waiting with supper." The drive to the farm took over an hour. The wagon jolted along a bumpy road that wound through wild, rugged, but incredibly beautiful countryside. There were no neat hedges or flawless lawns of the Blackwood estate here. There were only hills covered in heather, dark forests, and fast, rocky streams. Jacob's farm was exactly as Ethan had described it. A small stone house, low and sturdy, a few outbuildings, and fields that stretched to the edge of the forest. They were met by Jacob's wife, Martha, a short, strong woman with kind eyes and hands accustomed to work. She hugged Ethan, then smiled warmly at Serafina, and there was not a shadow of judgment in her gaze. "Come inside, you must be tired and hungry," she said. The house was simple and clean inside. A fire crackled in the large hearth in the main room, and it smelled of freshly baked bread and dried herbs. Supper consisted of a thick vegetable stew, bread, and cheese. To Serafina, accustomed to exquisite multi-course meals, this simple food seemed the most delicious in the world. She ate, feeling the tension drain away, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a real, healthy hunger. After supper, Martha showed them their room. It was a small attic under the roof, clean and cozy, with a wide bed covered with a patchwork quilt and a small window overlooking the fields. All that remained of her past life was the small travel case with her clothes and the sapphire brooch in her pocket. She put the case in a corner and went to the window. Below, in the darkness, not a single light was visible, only the stars, bright and close, as she had never seen them before. Ethan came up behind her and put his arms around her shoulders. "Welcome home, Serafina," he said quietly. There was so much tenderness in his voice that tears welled up in her eyes. She turned to him and hugged him tightly. This was their home. It didn't matter that it was small and simple. The important thing was that they were here together. The next morning, Serafina woke to the crowing of a rooster. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in soft pink hues. She went downstairs and saw that Ethan had already gone out to the fields with Jacob. Martha was bustling by the hearth. "Good morning, child," she smiled. "Breakfast is on the table." Serafina sat down and, for the first time in her life, felt awkward and useless. Martha moved quickly and skillfully, milking the cow, feeding the chickens, kneading dough. And she, Serafina, knew how to do nothing. Her delicate hands, trained only in drawing and playing the piano, seemed alien and ridiculous. "Martha," she said resolutely, rising from the table, "please, teach me. I want to help. I want to work." Martha looked at her determined face, and her kind smile grew wider. "All right," she said, "we'll start with the chickens. They're not as picky as your father was." And so Serafina, the former heiress of Blackwood Manor, picked up a basket and, for the first time in her life, went to collect eggs. Her hands trembled, and she was afraid of breaking the fragile shells. But when she found the first, still warm egg in the hay, her heart filled with a strange, unfamiliar joy. It was her first job, the first step in her new, real life. She knew there would be many difficulties ahead. She would have to learn everything from scratch. But looking at her hands, stained with straw, she knew she had never been happier. The first few weeks on the farm were a harsh trial for Serafina. Her body, pampered by years of idleness, rebelled against the unaccustomed exertion. Every morning she woke with aching muscles she never knew she had. Her delicate hands, which had only known the cool ivory of piano keys and the smoothness of silk, were now covered in calluses and scratches from working in the vegetable garden and tending to the poultry. She learned to weed the beds, carry water from the well, churn butter, and knead dough. Often she failed. The dough wouldn't rise, the milk would boil over, and the weeds she pulled would reappear the next day, as if mocking her efforts. At first, Jacob watched her with silent skepticism. He saw her only as a fragile city lady who was about to break and beg to be taken back to her golden cage. He never said anything hurtful, but his silence was more eloquent than words. Serafina felt his distrust, and it only fueled her stubbornness. She didn't complain, didn't cry, and didn't ask for any special treatment. After each failure, she just gritted her teeth and tried again. One day, as she was trying to split a log for the stove, the axe slipped and hit her shin hard. She cried out in pain and sat on the ground, clutching the bruised spot. Jacob, who was working nearby, came over, silently took the axe from her, and split the log with one precise blow. Then he looked down at her sitting on the ground, and for the first time, she saw something akin to respect in his eyes. "You don't hit with all your might. You hit in the right spot," he grumbled, offering her a hand to help her up. Like with everything else in life, it was the first time he had spoken to her about something other than work. And that moment was a turning point. Ethan was her rock. In the evenings, when the grueling work was done, they would go up to their attic, and the small room would become their universe. He would massage her tired shoulders, rub her hands with a healing salve that Martha prepared, and tell her about the stars that burned so brightly in their window. Here, away from everyone, their love, tempered by hardship, only grew stronger. It was no longer a fragile, secret flower. It had become a sturdy tree that had put down roots in this harsh but honest land. "Do you regret it?" he asked her one evening as they lay wrapped in each other's arms under the patchwork quilt, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. "Not for a second," she answered without hesitation, pressing closer to him. "Sometimes it's painful and difficult, and I feel so inept, but I've never felt so alive. Before, my body was just a beautiful shell. Now I feel it. I feel it working, getting tired, growing stronger. I feel real." But the shadow of the past had not completely left them. Once a month, Jacob would go to the nearest town to sell cheese and eggs and buy supplies. On one of these trips, he brought back a recent newspaper from the South, given to him by a traveling salesman. In the evening, as they all sat by the fire, Serafina's eyes chanced upon it, and she froze. On the third page was a small article under the headline, "Heiress's Mysterious Disappearance." It reported in reserved tones that Miss Serafina Blackwood, daughter of the prominent financier Henry Blackwood, whose engagement to Mr. Alistair Croft was to take place last week, had suddenly left the family estate due to ill health. The family requested that their privacy be respected during this difficult time. But between the lines, a different story could be read. The article ended by mentioning that Mr. Blackwood had hired the best private detectives to ensure the safety and well-being of his daughter. A chill gripped her heart. They were looking for her, not just waiting for her to return, but actively searching. She passed the newspaper to Ethan. He read the article and his face darkened. Jacob and Martha understood too. "They won't find you here," Martha said firmly, covering Serafina's hand with her own. "This is a different world. No one asks unnecessary questions here." But that night, Serafina couldn't sleep for a long time. She stared out the dark window and thought of her father. She knew him. He wouldn't give up. For him, it was a matter of honor, a matter of control. He would search for her until the end. Their peaceful, secluded life was as fragile as an eggshell. The next morning, she woke with a new resolve. She went to Ethan, who was mending a fence near the house. "Ethan," she said, "I want to start a small garden here. There's an empty patch of land behind the house." He looked at her in surprise. "It's almost autumn. It's too late to plant anything." "Not for everything," she replied. "We can plant winter garlic and some flowers that need to overwinter in the ground to bloom in the spring. I want us to have something of our own, something that will put down roots here in this soil, just like us." Ethan smiled, and his smile held all the love and pride he felt for her. He put down his tools and went for a spade. Together, they began to dig up the small, weed-choked patch of land. This was their answer to the threat from the past. They would not hide in fear. They would build their life, plant their garden, and put down roots so deep that no storm could tear them out. Months passed. Autumn, with its crimson and gold, gave way to a long, harsh winter. Snow blanketed the farm in a thick white layer, muffling all sounds and turning the world into a monochrome etching. Life slowed down, submitting to the ancient rhythm of nature. The days grew short and were filled with work, tending to the livestock in the warm barn, chopping wood for the ever-hungry stove, mending harnesses and tools in the dimly lit shed. For Serafina, this period was a time of internal transformation. The physical labor, which had at first seemed like torture, became a habit, and then a source of satisfaction. She learned to bake bread whose aroma filled the house, to darn clothes by the light of a kerosene lamp, and even to help Martha with a calving cow. Her body grew strong, and a healthy flush appeared on her cheeks, something that neither expensive creams nor prescribed rests in her past life could achieve. But it wasn't just her body that changed. Something shifted in her soul as well. She discovered that her artistic talent hadn't vanished but had merely been seeking a new application. She bought a simple sketchbook and charcoal pencils in town and began to draw. But these were no longer languid portraits and idealized landscapes. She drew Martha's gnarled hands kneading dough, Jacob's focused face as he repaired a plow, and again, Ethan. She drew him as he chopped wood, muscles rippling on his back. As he laughed, crinkles forming at the corners of his eyes. As he slept beside her, serene and peaceful. Her drawings were full of life, truth, and a love that had been absent from her earlier work. Their small garden, started in the autumn, slept beneath the snow. But for them, it was a promise of the future. During the long winter evenings, when the whole family gathered by the fire, Serafina and Ethan made plans. They studied old farmers' almanacs, arguing over the best place to plant potatoes and where to put the beans. Serafina, recalling Lady Eloise's diaries, suggested planting flowers next to the vegetables to deter pests. Jacob grumbled at first that it was women's nonsense, but then listened with interest to her arguments about the benefits of marigolds and calendula. They had become a family. The gruff Jacob, seeing her perseverance, developed a fatherly affection for her. And Martha replaced her mother in a way Isabella Blackwood never could have. They were poor, but their life was filled with meaning, hard work, and mutual support. The fear sparked by the newspaper article gradually subsided, turning into a dull, background anxiety. They were so far from that world that it seemed it couldn't reach them. But it did. It happened on a rare sunny day at the end of February. when the timid breath of spring could already be felt in the air. Jacob returned from town earlier than usual. He entered the house without shaking the snow from his boots, his face darker than a storm cloud. "There was a stranger there," he said, slumping onto the bench by the hearth. "In the tavern. Not from around here." Everyone froze. Martha stopped stirring the stew. Serafina, who was peeling potatoes, stopped with the knife in her hand. "What kind of stranger?" Ethan asked quietly. "Well-dressed," Jacob ground out. "In a city coat despite the mud. Hands clean, no calluses. Sat alone, drinking tea and listening to the conversations. And then he started asking questions. Cautiously, indirectly, wondering if any new people had shown up in the area in the last 6 months. A young couple, perhaps. Serafina's heart skipped a beat. She felt an icy lump form in her throat. "Did he ask about us?" "He didn't name anyone specifically," Jacob replied, staring grimly into the fire. "But I saw his eyes, sharp like a hawk's. He wasn't just curious. He was looking. And also," Jacob paused as if deciding whether to say it. "On his little finger he wore a ring, a gold one, with a black stone, engraved with the head of a griffin." Serafina dropped the knife. It fell to the stone floor with a dull thud. She knew that ring. A griffin, the crest of the Croft family. She had seen that ring on Alistair's finger 100 times. But this wasn't him. This was the ring of his personal assistant, his right-hand man, a ruthless and efficient man named Gray. The world they had built with such difficulty began to crack at the seams. The long, tenacious tentacles of her past had reached them even here, in this remote place. "They've found us," she whispered, and her voice held no fear, only a dull, cold statement of fact. Ethan came to her and squeezed her shoulders tightly. She looked up at him, her eyes full of despair. The warmth and safety of their little home was once again invaded by the cold. The fire in the hearth still crackled, but none of them felt its warmth anymore. Their sanctuary had been discovered. The news Jacob brought fell into the center of their small world like a stone into a quiet pond, sending out waves of fear and uncertainty. Supper that evening was a tense, silent affair. Everyone was thinking the same thing. The man with the griffin ring wouldn't stop at asking questions in a tavern. That was just reconnaissance. Soon he or someone else would appear here on their doorstep. The old fear that Serafina thought she had learned to live with returned with renewed force, its icy fingers tightening around her throat. She looked at Ethan's calloused, work-roughened hands, at Jacob's stern but kind face, at the caring wrinkles around Martha's eyes. These people had become her family, and now, because of her, they were all in danger. "We have to leave again," Ethan said that same evening, when they were alone in their attic. His voice was hollow with suppressed rage. "Right now, before they come here, we can go further north into the mountains or cross the border. We can't let them destroy this life too." He was saying what she expected to hear. He was ready to drop everything again to protect her. But as she listened, Serafina realized she couldn't run anymore. Escaping from Blackwood Manor had been an act of liberation. A new escape from this farm, from this land into which they had already poured so much work and love, would be an act of defeat. "No," she said, quietly but firmly. Ethan looked at her in surprise. "No, Ethan, I'm tired of running. If we run now, we'll be running for the rest of our lives. They will always be one step behind. This fear will always be with us." She got up and went to the small window. The snow under the moon sparkled like scattered diamonds. "When I lived at the estate, I was their property," she continued, gazing at the sleeping fields. "A beautiful object to be sold for a profit. I ran away to stop being an object. But if I keep hiding, it means I'm still afraid of them, that they still have power over me. I don't want to live like that. But what can we do?" Despair was in Ethan's voice. "Your father, Alistair. They have money, power. They'll hire anyone to do what?" She turned to him, and a fire he had never seen before burned in her eyes. "To drag me back by force? Lock me in a room?" The The Serafina who ran away 6 months ago is gone. I've changed. I've worked this land. I know what it is to be tired and in pain. And I know what it is to be happy. They can't take that from me by force. Not again. She went to him and took his face in her hands. Her hands, no longer as soft as they once were, gently touched his stubble. "We won't run," she said. "We will meet them, here on our land. We won't hide. We will live. And if they come, I will speak to them. Not as a frightened girl, but as a woman who has made her choice." The next 2 days passed in agonizing suspense. The tension hung in the air, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jacob cleaned the old hunting rifle that hung over the fireplace and silently stood it in a corner. Martha kept going out to the porch, peering down the road. Ethan never left Serafina's side, his face grim and determined. They came on the 3rd day. It was a cold, clear afternoon. Serafina and Martha were carrying ashes from the hearth when a carriage appeared on the road leading to the farm. Not a simple farmer's wagon, but an expensive, black, enclosed carriage, drawn by a pair of black horses. It approached slowly and relentlessly, its lacquered sides gleaming in the winter sun. Ethan and Jacob came out of the barn, holding a pitchfork and an axe. Serafina's heart pounded furiously, but she forced herself to stand tall. She took Martha's hand, and together they watched the carriage stop at the gate of their home. The door opened, and a man in an expensive coat stepped onto the snowy ground. Mr. Gray. His cold, hawk-like eyes quickly scanned the yard, lingering on the men with the axe and pitchfork, on the 2 women on the porch, and finally settling on Serafina. A shadow of a contemptuous smile flickered on his thin lips. Then a second man emerged from the carriage, and Serafina's breath caught in her throat. Alistair. He looked as immaculate as ever. A perfectly tailored coat, boots polished to a mirror shine, a top hat in his hand. But something about him had changed. His eyes no longer held their former smug emptiness. There was a cold, restrained fury and something that looked like pain. He walked slowly towards the house, his boots crunching on the snow. He stopped a few steps from the porch, his gaze fixed on Serafina. He looked at her simple clothes, her weathered cheeks, her hands stained with ash. He looked at Ethan, who stood between her and him like a rock. "Hello, Serafina," he said, his voice tense. "The performance is over. It's time to come home." "This is my home," Serafina replied calmly. Alistair sneered. "This barn? Don't make me laugh. You are a Blackwood. Your place is there with your family, with your future husband." "I already have a husband," she said, taking a step forward and placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Alistair's face contorted. "This gardener? You traded everything you had for him? For this dirt? This poverty?" "I traded a cage for freedom." Her voice did not tremble. It was full of the strength she had gained over these months. "I traded loneliness for love. I traded idleness for work that brings joy. You don't understand that, Alistair, and you never will. For you, everything is measured in money. But there are things that can't be bought. And I will not let you take them from me." "Your father is beside himself," Alistair ground out. "He won't stop until he gets you back. He will destroy him," he nodded towards Ethan, "and his entire family. He will ruin them, cast them out. Is that what you really want?" It was the same threat, the same blackmail. But this time, Serafina was ready for it. "My father can try," she replied, "but he can no longer control me. And I am no longer afraid of him." She looked him straight in the eye. "Leave, Alistair. Forget about me. Tell my father that Serafina Blackwood is dead. The person standing before you is Serafina Evans. And she has made her choice." She said Ethan's surname, for the first time, and it sounded like a vow. Alistair stood motionless, staring at her. He could see that it was true. There was no fear or doubt in her eyes. The girl he had known was gone. In her place stood a strange, strong woman who looked at him without hatred, but with something far worse, complete indifference. He had lost, and he knew it. He turned silently and got back into the carriage. Gray cast one last cold glance at them and followed him. The door slammed shut. The carriage turned around and slowly drove away, leaving deep ruts in the clean snow. They stood without moving until the black carriage disappeared over the hill. Only then did the tension release them. Serafina turned and buried her face in Ethan's chest. He held her tightly. Jacob lowered the axe. Martha began to cry. Quiet, happy tears. They had won. Not with force, but with spirit. Spring came early that year. The snow melted, and the earth, freed from its winter bonds, breathed with moisture and life. Their little garden, which they had started in the autumn, awoke. The first green shoots of garlic emerged, and next to them, by the wall of the house, tender leaves appeared. One warm April day, when the sun was already warming like summer, Serafina was working in the garden. She was loosening the soil around a young bush she had grown from the very cutting Ethan had once given her. She had brought it with her, and it had survived the winter. Ethan came over and sat on the ground beside her.